What if I told you the most powerful weapon America ever created isn't the nuclear bomb, the aircraft carrier, or Silicon Valley? What if the true weapon, the silent one, is a $33 trillion debt machine that doesn't fire bullets, but bends entire nations without ever launching a single missile? Sounds crazy. Then ask yourself this. Why do countries from Africa to Europe, even U.S. rivals, scramble for dollars every time a crisis hits? Why does every global meltdown magically strengthen the American financial system while everyone else burns? And more importantly, why does your life, your rent, your groceries, your fuel, your job stability depend on decisions made inside a boardroom in Washington, D.C. by people you'll never meet? Because the world has been wired intentionally into a system where dollar debt is the oxygen of global trade, and America controls the oxygen tank. And here's the truth they will never admit publicly. Debt isn't America's weakness. Debt is America's weapon. A $33 trillion weapon. Tonight, we're going to expose the mechanics behind this empire, how the U.S. engineered a financial structure so dominant, so unavoidable, that entire nations can be brought to their knees by a single phone call from the Federal Reserve. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you watching this from? Seriously, drop your city in the comments. This channel has become a community of people who want the unfiltered truth, and if you're one of them, make sure you're subscribed. Because what you're about to hear is the kind of story mainstream media will never touch. All right, let's begin. To understand how America weaponized debt, we need to go back. Not to 2008, not even to 1971. We need to return to 1944. To a small hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where 44 nations gathered to rewrite the financial architecture of the post-war world. The official story: they created a stable global monetary system to prevent another Great Depression. The real story: they created a system where every currency was indirectly tied to the U.S. dollar, because the dollar alone was pegged to gold. America became the anchor of global finance, not because it was the smartest, not because it was the fairest, but because it was the only country left with gold, factories, and an intact economy after the war. Everyone else was rebuilding from rubble. Sound familiar? A world crisis happens, and one nation emerges stronger than before. We've seen the same pattern in 1997, 2008, 2020. Disasters weaken others but strengthen the U.S. back to Bretton Woods. Countries needed dollars to trade, so they borrowed dollars. Governments, corporations, entire economies all plugged directly into an American-controlled system. And here's the key mistake the world made. They believed America would always play fair. Fast forward to 1971. President Nixon walks up to a podium and says, "We are temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold." Temporarily, it became permanent. And overnight, the dollar became a pure fiat currency. No gold, no physical backing, just trust. But here's the twist. Instead of collapsing, the dollar became even more powerful, because without gold limitations, America could issue unlimited debt. And if the world needed dollars, which they did, then the world needed American debt. Sound familiar? Whenever a system becomes too dependent on something, that something becomes the master, and everything else becomes the servant. By the 1980s, the game was set. Global trade, loans, commodities, and reserves all denominated in dollars. Even today, as of recent global numbers, 88% of international trade uses dollars, 59% of global reserves are held in dollars. Over $13 trillion of global debt is dollar-denominated. Think about that. Nations borrow money in a currency they don't control, from a country that does control it. And a central bank, the Federal Reserve, that can print or restrict dollars at will. Sound familiar? It's the same strategy used by kings, emperors, and colonial powers throughout history. Make others depend on you for survival, then dictate the terms, But Bretton Woods was only the beginning. The true weaponization came later, through a structure most people have never heard of. Federal Reserve swap lines, the invisible pipelines that send dollars to chosen nations during crises and leave others to suffocate. When the world panics, guess who controls the oxygen supply? This is where modern history begins to rhyme. Look at 1997. The Asian financial crisis wiped out economies overnight. Currencies collapsed. Millions fell into poverty. Why? Because they had dollar debts, and when dollar liquidity dried up, their entire financial systems imploded. Look at 2013. The taper tantrum. The Fed suggested, not implemented, just suggested reducing bond purchases. Emerging markets collapsed instantly. Look at 2020. The pandemic froze global trade. What happened? Countries begged the Federal Reserve for swap lines just to survive the month. Even us allies, like Japan and Europe, felt the squeeze. Others, like most developing nations, didn't even get access. Dollar scarcity creates fear. Fear creates obedience. And obedience creates an empire. But here's the part they don't want you to see. This isn't an accident. It isn't random. The dollar debt system is designed meticulously to create permanent dependency. While the world sees us debt as America's weakness, the insiders see it as something far more strategic, a chain, a leash, a lock on global power. But buckle up, because we're about to enter the part of the story where the accidental becomes intentional, where the historical becomes personal, and where the system shows its true teeth. Here's the twist nobody talks about. The real power of the American empire isn't the dollar itself. It's who gets the dollars during a crisis and who doesn't. And that power sits inside a quiet, almost never discussed mechanism. The Federal Reserve's swap lines. These swap lines are not loans. They're not treaties. They're not aid. They're pipes. Pipes that deliver trillions of dollars in emergency liquidity to selected nations instantly, privately, and without congressional approval. And once you look at the countries that get these swap lines and the ones who are denied, you start to notice a pattern. A pattern that isn't based on economic stability, isn't based on global cooperation, and certainly isn't based on need. The pattern is based on strategic obedience. You'll see Japan, the UK, Switzerland, and the Eurozone, all US aligned. You won't see countries like Argentina, Turkey, Nigeria, or most of Southeast Asian nations that depend heavily on dollars, but aren't aligned with American geopolitical goals. In other words, the Federal Reserve quietly became the global lender of lastries, but only for the countries America wants to keep close. Everyone else, they're left to drown. This is how empires control continents without marching armies. You don't seize the land, you seize the liquidity. But we're not done. Because there's one name, one architect who designed the modern global dollar system that allows all of this to happen. A name the media never mentions. And trust me, you won't believe the name. The receipt is wilder than you think. All right, let's pull back the curtain. Everything so far has been history and framing. But now we enter the machinery, the gears, the pipes, the inner workings of the empire. And it begins with something simple. Most countries borrow in a currency they do not control. Imagine running a business, but your loans, rent, payroll, equipment, and suppliers were all denominated in a foreign currency you had zero power over. If that currency rises, your debt explodes. If that currency disappears from markets, your economy freezes. That is the world's relationship with the US dollar. The three-part trap of the dollar empire. To understand how the US weaponized debt, you need to understand three mechanisms. 1. Dollar-denominated global debt. 2. The Eurodollar market. 3. Federal Reserve swap lines, the liquidity weapon individually. Each of these is powerful. Combined, they form the invisible empire. Let's break them down. 1. dollar-denominated global DEBT. The first chain. Here's the shocking truth. Over $13 trillion in global debt is denominated in US dollars outside the United States. That's larger than China's entire GDP, larger than the Eurozone's entire balance sheets. Why does this matter? Because when a country issues debt in its own currency, it can always print more to pay it back. Not ideal, but possible. But when it borrows in dollars, it must obtain dollars from global markets. If the dollar strengthens by 10%, their debt rises 10%. If the dollar strengthens by 30%, their debt rises 30%. Entire economies can be wiped out by a move they cannot control. And surprise, the dollar strengthens during almost every crisis. Coincidence or a strategy? Let me show you something chilling. Statistic number 1. Between 2014 and 2016, the US dollar surged 25%. Dozens of emerging economies saw their debts skyrocket overnight. Millions fell into poverty. Why did the dollar surge? Because the Federal Reserve merely hinted at raising interest rates. Just a hint. This is the power of a currency system designed to make others vulnerable and America untouchable. 2. The Eurodollar market, the shadow pipeline. Now comes the second chain, the one most people never hear about. The Eurodollar system. Despite the name, Eurodollars are not European. They are dollars held in offshore banks, primarily outside U.S. jurisdiction: London, Singapore, Zurich, Hong Kong, Cayman Islands. These offshore dollars form the true global money supply. And here's the terrifying part. No one controls it, not even the Federal Reserve. Eurodollars are created without printing. They are created by lending. A European bank issues a dollar loan, gives boom, new dollar. A Singapore bank lends to a hedge fund, gives boom, new dollar. This system grew so fast, so large, that by the 2000s, statistic number 2, the Eurodollar market contained more than $12 trillion in offshore dollar liabilities. This meant one thing. Global finance ran on dollars that America didn't create, but America was still expected to backstop during crisis, and that's exactly what they used as leverage. Because if banks around the world are using dollars, they cannot print. Then when liquidity dries up, there is only one entity that can save them: the Federal Reserve. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the real weapon. 3. The Federal Reserve swap lines. The liquidity weapon here is where the empire becomes unmistakable. During crises, the Federal Reserve activates swap lines. These are special agreements that allow select central banks to swap their currency for dollars instantly. Not loans, not aid. Direct access to the dollar printing press. But here's the shocker. Only 14 countries have permanent swap lines. Almost all are U.S. allies: Japan, Canada, the UK, Switzerland, the Eurozone. But what about Brazil, Argentina, Turkey, Nigeria, Vietnam? Most of Southeast Asia? Nothing. Zero. Denied. These countries must fight for dollars in open markets, usually during panic, when dollars are scarce and expensive. And when dollars are scarce, investors flee emerging markets first. Capital outflows hit like a tsunami. Currencies collapse. Social unrest erupts. Governments destabilize, and when they fall to their knees, the IMF appears with rescue loans denominated in dollars. Debt upon debt. Dependency upon dependency. A cycle engineered, not accidental. And here's the kicker. Statistic number 3, during the 2020 crisis, the Fed pumped over $450 billion through swap lines in 30 days. That's more than the GDP of South Africa, Denmark, or Malaysia, but only 2 chosen nations. Everyone else. They were left outside the lifeboat, drowning in dollar shortages. This is how empires operate in the 21st century, not with guns, with liquidity. The real question, why does the US do this? Because the world needs dollars to survive, and America controls the supply. If the US cuts off a country from swap lines, it's equivalent to strangling them economically. A slow, devastating suffocation. This gives America three forms of global power. 1. Geopolitical leverage, support our sanctions, support our wars, support our economic policies, or face a liquidity drought. 2. Financial dominance, every crisis strengthens the dollar. Every dollar spike strengthens the U.S. Treasury market. Every Treasury purchase funds American deficits. 3. Perpetual demand for U.S. debt. This is the most shocking part. The world buys U.S. Treasuries not because they want to, but because they must. Treasuries are the oxygen tank. The world must hold them to access the dollar system. Even America's enemies fund America's debt. Let me repeat that. Statistic number 4. China alone holds over $760 billion in U.S. Treasuries. Russia, despite sanctions, previously held over $150 billion. Even Iran, through indirect channels, has historically relied on dollar clearing for trade. This is the greatest irony of modern history. Nations that oppose America still fund America's empire because the alternative is death by dollar starvation. The moral hazard. Why the U.S. can run $33 trillion in debt without collapsing every economics textbook will tell you. When debt is too high, a country collapses. Wrong. That's true for every other nation except the United States. Because American debt is not just borrowed money, it is global collateral. It is the world's savings account, the world's safety asset, the world's liquidity anchor. When panic hits, everyone runs to treasuries. Even Americans buy more treasuries. Even foreigners scramble to buy them. Treasuries become more valuable during crisis, not less. This is why, statistic number 5, during the 2008 crash, yields fell from 5% to nearly 0%. People paid a premium to lend money to a collapsing nation. Who else in history gets rewarded for financial chaos? Only an empire with a captive world. The playbook of the empire. Now let's lay out the steps that define America's debt weapon. Step 1. The U.S. runs massive deficits. It doesn't matter. Its debt becomes global collateral. Step 2. The world buys U.S. bonds because they need dollars. Treasuries equals oxygen tank. Step 3. Crises happen, dollar rises. Emerging markets collapse. Capital floods back to the U.S. Step 4. The Federal Reserve activates selective swap lines. Allies get oxygen. Non-allies suffocate. Step 5. The U.S. emerges stronger after every crisis. Dollars stronger. Treasuries more valuable. Foreign economies weaker. Dependency deeper. This cycle repeats every decade like clockwork. 1980s Latin American debt crisis. 1997 Asian financial crisis. 2000 dot-com crash. 2008 global financial crisis. 2013 taper tantrum. 2020 pandemic liquidity crisis. 2022 to 2023 inflation crisis. In every case, who came out stronger? The name behind the system, the architect of dollar hegemony. Earlier, I told you there was a name, a person behind the modern liquidity empire. That name is Alan Greenspan, the longest-serving Federal Reserve chairman in U.S. history, the man who deregulated derivatives, the man who encouraged unlimited debt, the man who created the Greenspan put the idea that the Fed would always rescue the markets. He engineered a system where Wall Street takes risks, gives crashes, gives Fed bails them out, gives dollar strengthens, gives us debt, becomes more valuable, gives, the world trusts the dollar more, not less. Greenspan didn't just manage monetary policy. He rewired global finance to funnel power to the U.S. and his successors, Bernanke, Yellen, Powell simply continued the playbook. This is why the dollar survives every crisis. Not because it is stable, but because the world cannot escape it. Debt is not America's weakness. Debt is America's dominion. And the more debt America issues, the stronger the empire grows. So now that you've seen the machinery, now that you've seen how the United States built an empire, not with armies, but with obligation, we need to talk about where this is going. Because here's the truth, no politician will admit, the dollar system is aging, the cracks are widening, and the next crisis will be faster, sharper, and global. For the past 50 years, every shock has made the dollar stronger. But leverage works both ways. And the world is now more addicted to dollar liquidity than at any point in history. Let me explain the danger in one sentence. When a system is built on borrowed time, it collapses the moment time runs out. Right now, global debt is over $315 trillion. The U.S. alone owes $33 trillion and is adding $1 trillion every 100 days. Emerging markets? Their dollar-denominated debt has ballooned so high that a mere 1% increase in U.S. interest rates can trigger currency collapse. Sound familiar? Japan is devaluing. Europe is stagnating. China is fighting capital flight. Developing nations are drowning. And Washington knows exactly what happens when the world runs out of dollars. They panic, they sell everything. They rush into U.S. treasuries. And America gets stronger, until the moment the system breaks from its own weight. That's the real threat. Not hyperinflation, not recession, but a global scramble for dollars so violent that entire nations default simultaneously, a financial blackout. The empire won't fall quietly. It will fail spectacularly. And the lesson hidden beneath every crisis is painfully simple. Denial is the most expensive currency on earth. If we pretend the system is stable, if we trust institutions that run on leverage, illusion, and moral hazard, we are not observers of collapse. We are participants in it. So here's the final question I want to leave you with. Are we wiser now, or just walking the same path in better suits? If you're still here, you're part of the community that asks the questions others avoid. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And if you want more unfiltered truth, hit subscribe. The next investigation drops soon. Stay alert, stay curious, stay awake.